So, what do I press? Okay. You have to kind of get with the glasses the right distance. What do I press now to go back and forward?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you could take your seat again. So I think we've had a lot of insight so far as to our famous series. And our final topic, innovation and invention in the Eucharist series, Rubens as tapestry designer. And our first speaker in this topic is Fiona Healey. She is an independent scholar specializing in the work of Peter Paul Rubens. Again, duh. Among her many publications are A House of Art, Rubens as Collector, and Rubens and the Judgment of Paris, A Question of Choice. She has collaborated on both the catalog and exhibition of Peter Paul Rubens' The Life of Achilles, the last set of tapestries that Peter Paul Rubens designed. She is currently preparing Corpus Rubenianum volumes on the Madonna, Holy Life, Life of the Virgin, the Trinity, and another on his mythologies. Now, if you're not familiar with the Corpus Rubenianum, this is an ongoing project that involves a community of scholars working to create a catalogue raisonné of the works of Peter Paul Rubens. And obviously, we couldn't talk about Rubens without Fiona.
Thank you, Maureen, for this very kind introduction, and you and Virginia for inviting me to participate, and to Barbara and all the staff here at the Ringling who have looked after us so well. And it really is a pleasure to be in sunny Florida. As you can all imagine, I am now feeling very disadvantaged at having to speak after Anna and Betsy, who have brought such new insights into the Tapestry series, the Eucharist series. So some of what I have to say has become obsolete, but I hope you'll still forgive me. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, forget all you know about the Eucharist series and imagine the following. If the only testimony of the Commission for the Descalces Reales were tapestries such as this one, and I really mean the only evidence, no bossetti, modelli, or cartoons, no engravings, nothing. How then would we judge the artistic merit of the series? What status would it assume within Rubens' large and varied oeuvre? We would certainly admire Rubens' inventive powers and accurate portrayal of theological, archaeological, and historical detail. And though stylistically somewhat diluted through the tapestry medium, we could still make a fairly accurate assessment of when Rubens made his design. That leaves us with the issue of artistic merit. I have little doubt that the series would assume a worthy place alongside Rubens' two earlier tapestry cycles, his Decius Mus of around 1618 and the Constantine series of around 1622. The structural parallels between all three are immediately obvious. The narrative scenes designed by Rubens are framed by a more or less elaborate surround composed of different elements: fruits, swags of flowers, putti, allegorical figures and personifications, architectural elements, mottos, personal devices, etc. But since Rubens' Eucharist tapestries have survived the vagaries of history, we can immediately judge the tapestry in Monaco to be but a fragment of his original idea. Only when the central narrative is reunited with its elaborate architectural frame is it possible to appreciate fully the aesthetic and groundbreaking qualities of Rubens's invention. As tapestries, the Deciusmus and Constantine cycles are conventional, where it is immediately obvious that for the triumph of the Eucharist, Rubens ventured into completely new territory. The innovative nature of Rubens' design has, of course, long been recognized by various scholars, but never fully explored once the significance of the architecture for the hanging of the tapestries within the Descalzes Reales had been recognized. The Bossetto in Chicago showing the decoration of, I had altar wall, but we now know it's the south wall, confirms that the tapestries hung in two tiers. Those with rusticated Tuscan columns on the lower level, those with the Solomonic order above them. But this sketch proves another important feature, namely that the tapestries were intended to hang seam to seam. While this appears to be an obvious point to make, the visual impact of such an arrangement is difficult to convey because the reconfiguration of the church's interior means it is impossible to establish how and in what sequence the tapestries originally hung, or now again superseded, I'm afraid. Documentary evidence from 1569 states that the white walls of the church were unadorned except for divisions in pilasters, and that on festive occasions were entirely covered with embroidered hangings to the size of the walls. That means the whole walls were covered. So it will probably have been the case that sometimes the tapestries hung seam to seam. In some places, the church's pilasters will have interrupted the sequence. So to illustrate the effect, I have made a simple mock-up using some of the tapestries. Though, of course, I realize that I have made things easy by deliberately not addressing the difficult and until today, unresolved issue of the order in which the tapestries hung, which Anna has now done for us. But what I'm interested in showing here is how Rubens succeeded in manipulating the perception of space in which worshippers in the church of the Descalzes Reales found themselves. What we know to have been a relatively simple interior is suddenly transformed into a sophisticated architectural edifice with elaborate columns from which magnificent tapestries are suspended. If we were talking about simply creating an illusion on a wall, then Rubens's architectural construction would be notable, but not necessarily remarkable. After all, from earliest times, artists strove to achieve such visual deception, as wonderfully illustrated by these two Italian examples. And since I'm not allowed to use a pointer, I can't really point out what's painted and what's real, but the rear wall of the cathedral entrance is entirely painted to create the illusion that there is a long area on top in which figures are standing. Rubens' achievement is, however, different because he applied it to a totally different medium. And the illusion succeeds only because he took one decisive step, namely to abolish the defining characteristic of the physical and aesthetic structure of tapestries, the border. In order to demonstrate exactly how unprecedented this decision was, it is worth looking briefly at the evolution and design of tapestry borders, though I hasten to add that such an overview can only be superficial at best. Borders are, of course, vital to tapestry historians, because it is there one finds the weaver's marks that tell us so much about the history and production of tapestries. Yet despite the aesthetic diversity of borders and the impact they have on our appreciation of the scene they frame, no general study of borders appears to have been undertaken, or at least I did not discover one, even though, as we shall see, there are many questions that need answering. Borders of the kind you see here were introduced during the last quarter of the 15th century, probably in Brussels, which was beginning to emerge as the most important center of tapestry production in Europe. Some isolated examples could be found in Italy, such as these two, both of which have trompe-l'œil surrounds. That by Cosime Ture imitates a wooden frame decorated with cabochon jewels, while the Annunciation attributed to Andrea Mantegna has a faux marble border. The obvious proximity of the composition and style of these tapestries to contemporary Italian painting goes some way towards explaining why the borders resemble so closely the manner of framing pictures or frescoes. It is as if the medium tapestry strove to imitate the medium paint. But back to the north. For most of the 15th century and earlier, Northern European tapestries did without borders altogether. The design simply extended to the very edge of the tapestry, which was kept from unraveling by a simple, narrow selvage. But a dramatic transformation of both the appearance and production of tapestries was on the way, prompted, I suggest, by the settlement in 1476 of a dispute between Brussels tapestry weavers and painters. In order to prevent the weavers using cartoons made by painters living in Brussels who were not registered members of the Guild of St. Luke, that is the Painters' Guild, it was agreed that all figural and architectural parts of the cartoons would be provided only by guild painters. Consequently, all that was left to the weavers was to fill in the gaps with flora and fauna. The involvement of Brussels painters, whose style was very much influenced by that of Rogier van der Weyden, placed new demands on the weavers. They had to improve their weaving techniques to convincingly portray the increased sense of realism and illusion, both in the depiction of space and the human form. This they did with such success that Brussels became the international center of tapestry production. Both the new legal requirements and aesthetic advancement served, I believe, as catalysts for the introduction of borders and influenced the form and choice of their decor. Like the Italian example shown above, the pictorial quality of the work is emphasized by the addition of a frame. But unlike their southern counterparts, the Brussels weavers, consciously one suspects, deliberately avoided imitating the frames of panel paintings. Instead, they sought to exploit the possibilities offered by the woven surrounds to demonstrate their own specific contribution, both technically and decoratively, to the finished product. In the triumph of fame, the weavers filled in all visible ground space with flowers and foliage, and then continued the floral theme by placing between the two rounded moldings a garland made up of stems of roses, marigolds, and grapevines, bound together with pink ribbons. And while the border of the Mass of St. Gregory adheres to the same principles, the inclusion of different types of birds adds variety. This ability to create something new using a comparatively small repertoire of objects confined within a four-sided restricted form would be exploited to the full by weavers over the coming centuries. Borders were adapted to express changing tastes, geographic peculiarities, personal choices, would become wider or narrower, more or less colorful, simple or complicated. But in principle, the basic structure as found in these early examples continued until the 19th century, when under William Morris and the Pre-Raphaelites in England, tapestry making once again reached new heights. Borders, however, could be more than decorative. Raphael was the first to exploit their potential by using smaller, iconographically relevant scenes as a supporting text to the main narrative. In 1516, he designed a set of 10 Acts of the Apostles at the behest of Pope Leo X for the Sistine Chapel. Below each narrative, simulated bronze reliefs illustrate events related to the main scene. Here, Saul consenting to the death of St. Stephen and persecuting Christians prior to his conversion. All the cartoons, including those for the borders, were painted in Raphael's workshop and sent to Brussels, where the tapestries were woven between 1517 and 21 in the workshop of Peter van Elst. The completed tapestries were dispatched to Rome, while the cartoons remained in Brussels. But whereas the narrative scenes retained their iconic status as masterpieces by Raphael, his borders were only partially usable for subsequent weavings. In the set acquired before 1557 by Cardinal Ercole Gonzaga, Raphael's side borders are retained as their figures from classical antiquity were universally applicable, though naturally the Gonzaga arms replaced those of Leo X. However, the simulated bronze scenes that are so specific to the function of the tapestries within the Sistine Chapel were replaced by more classical gods and allegorical figures, and therefore stylistically and iconographically in keeping with the side panels. Yet another significant change can be observed. The dense floral garlands which replaced Raphael's narrow red and gold gouache frame create a more illusionistic three-dimensional impression, causing the central scene to retreat into the distance. In the 1630s, Charles I of England had another set woven in Mortlake, the famous English manufacture, using new cartoons copied from the originals by Francis Klein, who designed a different border for each of the tapestries. Indeed, Klein was instrumental in establishing Mortlake's reputation for producing extravagant borders. So while the central scene, as with the Acts of the Apostles, remained the same, the borders changed. As we have seen, this could be for a number of reasons. The addition of a new border converted a familiar, much repeated scene into a unique object. Patrons could individualize their commissions by having their coats of arms incorporated into the border. And of course, ever-changing decorative styles and tastes were best expressed through new borders which modernized a revered old master. As demonstrated by these two tapestries from the set of 7 Deadly Sins designed by Peter Koke van Aalst in 1532-33. The Triumph of Lust, woven in Brussels in the early 1540s, has an elaborate border of fruit and flowers, enlivened by birds and butterflies, playful putti, and a moralizing cartouche. A decade later, around 1555, the same cartoons were modernized by Willem de Pannemacher, who encased his set, here the Triumph of Envy, in a sophisticated border using fashionable strap or scroll work. But we also have examples of the reverse process, whereby the same border was used in different workshops. In 1564, de Pannemacher used this rather restrained design to frame his famous garden landscapes for Cardinal Antoine Pernod de Granvelle, while an enhanced version, augmented at the top by a tablet with an inscription, was also used for the Vision of St. Peter, woven by Franz Gethel between 1563 and 1567. It would be interesting to know how exactly such a transfer or sharing of border designs between workshops functioned. Did the proprietor of one workshop lend, rent, or sell border designs? Did workshops employ specialists, like Klein in Mortlake, to create suitable designs for borders? Or were they independent draftsmen who supplied the genre, who specialized in the genre and sold their designs, or variations thereof, to more than one workshop? How was the cost of a border calculated? And what difference did it make if the border was supplied by the artist responsible for the main scene or by the weaver? It may be that the lack of documentary evidence makes it impossible to answer many of these questions. But it seems to me that a considerable amount of information on borders is available. It just needs to be collated into a cohesive study. But back to the tapestries. The rising popularity of garden and landscape scenes like those of the Granvelle series is indicative of an overall trend towards experimentation from around the 1530s, both in terms of subject matter and structural conception. Still, as these examples show, the notion of a frame remained constant, even when contours were becoming ever more playful. If nothing else, this overview shows that Rubens's Eucharist series is so different that we are surely justified in questioning the extent to which he was experimenting with the medium of tapestry at all. I think it probable that it was never his aim to revolutionize the appearance and conventions of tapestry making. And indeed, even though he knew his artistic invention would be conveyed through tapestries, the medium as such was, I believe, of only secondary importance. The key to understanding this is the special relationship between Rubens and the Archduchess Isabella. And here I show you the engraving after the portrait. Though she never returned to Spain following her departure for the Netherlands in 1598, Isabella retained her emotional attachment to the Descalzes Reales, where she had spent so much of her childhood and youth. Her memories of it, and in particular the magnificent celebrations of the Eucharist, will have remained with her. When deliberating the commission with Rubens, she undoubtedly recounted the many details of the rituals of these celebrations, including the fact that the church was covered with embroidered hangings to the size of the walls. Her gift to the convent was so important to her that she would not have passed up the opportunity to discuss it in detail with the man who enjoyed her total confidence, not only as an artist, but also as a trusted advisor and diplomat, and of whose loyalty to her and the Spanish crown she had no doubt. When exactly the Archduchess entrusted Rubens with the commission is unclear, but there are good reasons for dating it to around 1625, and indeed it has been persuasively argued that the commission may be directly related to the success of the Spanish troops in recapturing the town of Breda on June the 11th, 1625. While we cannot confirm this, we do know that Isabella, having been in Breda, returned home to Brussels via Antwerp, where on July 10th, 1625, she paid a visit to Rubens, had her portrait painted, and was shown his famous art collection. The artist's house had become one of the must-see sites in Antwerp. He had purchased the property in late 1610 and installed his family in the existing 16th century house, which you will see on the right, which is on the left, on the top left-hand image of the house today. Opposite the extensive studio, which he had designed himself according to the most modern Italian ideals of architecture. From these two engravings and contemporary descriptions, we know he decorated the facades facing the courtyard and garden with herms, busts of ancient philosophers, as well as scenes illustrating famous paintings and painters of the classical world. Rubens deliberately executed them in grisaille, so as to trick the eye into thinking the scenes were actually sculpted, and indeed they are today recreated as reliefs. Rubens' desire to deceive through his mastery of the art of illusion reached its high point in the trompe-l'oeil that decorated the side wall of his studio, as we see in Harrowine's engraving. And that's the detail on the right. The print was the primary source for the recreation of the house in the late 1930s, so that today the Rubens house boasts a wide loggia on the first floor. And you can just about see that on the slide of the house. It's on the very right, you can see the openings. However, documents subsequently surfaced which prove that while the staircase really did exist, the loggia above it, which in the engraving shows a couple leaning over the balustrade, was in fact entirely painted. Rubens, moreover, took the illusion a step further by adding, this time in full color, a canvas depicting one of his own paintings, a Perseus liberating Andromeda, the composition of which is identical with the version today in St. Petersburg, and I think in this company I should add Russia. It was common practice at that time to hang paintings out to dry in the sun, and it was this illusion which Rubens sought to achieve. Very effectively, it would seem, judging from the reaction of the Archduchess, who reputedly was so convinced that it really was a canvas that she asked for it to be taken down, presumably because it obscured the frieze behind it. While it is easy to dismiss this as purely anecdotal, it will, like all such stories, contain a grain of truth. Moreover, it represents the type of exchange that would have been expected of a polite and educated visitor to Rubens's house. I therefore think it very likely that it was Isabella's admiration of his house, and in particular the decoration of its facade, that sowed the seed in Rubens's mind of devising an equally elaborate architectural illusion for his patron's prestigious commission. Of the various factors which will have made tapestries the most obvious choice of medium for the triumph of the Eucharist, a very significant one will have been the necessity of having a flexible, decorative system that could be easily installed, removed, and stored. Rubens clearly realized that he could not transform the interior of the church into a completely different space using the standard form of tapestries. We do not know what Rubens saw during his visits to the Brussels court or during his many foreign travels. But we may assume he would have had occasion to be in a room hung wall to wall with tapestries. Whether displayed on their own, as here in Hampton Court or in Cracov's Royal Castle, or in conjunction with elaborate wall decorations as in the Sistine Chapel, where Raphael's Acts of the Apostles form a cohesive whole with the frescoes above them, the borders define the space through their unmistakable horizontal but especially vertical formations. For Rubens to go another route, he had to free himself from the structural constraints of the conventional tapestry. It has always been assumed that Rubens's knowledge of wall paintings depicting famed tapestries provided a significant contribution to his design. Certainly he will have seen many such works whilst in Italy, and here I show two of the more famous examples by Raphael, which we know Rubens studied. You can see how the border, together with the manner of stretching the cloth across a space, or showing the nails from which it hangs, are the visual aids that help the viewer identify the object as a feigned tapestry. Another typical device was to show folds made by the tapestry falling on an object, such as the base of the painted pillars in this lesser-known and highly decorative fictive tapestry in Santa Susanna, which is frequently mentioned in connection with the Eucharist series. However, I hesitate to place all too great a significance on the inspirational value of such works, given the highly creative illusionistic effect Rubens achieved on the walls of his own house. It is therefore my conclusion that Rubens sought to create an illusion unlike anything done before. It is often pointed out that he was the first to depict a fictive tapestry in a real tapestry. But in fact, his achievement is far more sophisticated. We have seen it was commonplace for artists to paint walls as if hung with tapestries. But Rubens turned this commonplace on its head by showing tapestries with massive architecture, thereby creating the illusion, if not of real architecture, then at least of painted walls adorned with fictive tapestries. Instead of using a cheaper form of decoration to suggest the most expensive, Rubens plays with the viewer's expectations and presumptions of grandeur by implying the opposite. So what, if any, is the legacy of his unconventional design? Well, it certainly encouraged Rubens to again turn his back on tradition for his next and final venture into tapestry design. It is widely believed that the designs for the Achilles series were made in the 1630s for the tapestry dealer Daniel Faurmont, who was also Rubens's father-in-law. Here Rubens adopted a similar but modified strategy, for the architecture is now less overpowering, but more sophisticated. The columns are transformed into terms depicting classical gods and personifications who comment on or are associated with the narrative scene. The terms in the wrath of Achilles personify blind rage on the left and discord on the right, while in the death of Achilles, the hero is shot in his proverbial heel by Paris, whose arrow is guided by Apollo, also present as the term on the left with the serpent of deceit, while Venus, the goddess of love, in the term opposite, alludes to Achilles' ill-fated love affair with Polyxena. The chained line on the plinth signifying suppressed rage, and the fox devouring the eagle denoting cunning overcoming strength, are just two of the many visualizations of Homeric similes deployed by Rubens throughout the Achilles series. So whereas the triumph of the Eucharist plays with illusion in a visually sophisticated manner by showing tapestries feigning architecture, supporting feigned tapestries, the Achilles series demands greater erudition from its audience, which is probably one reason why Rubens's iconographically complex frames were frequently replaced by more conventional ones. Here, pretty flower garlands are wrapped around twisted columns, and the literary simile has been eliminated. Rubens's new conception may not have revolutionized the world of tapestry design, but in Antwerp at least it exerted considerable influence. Two artists in particular stand out. Jacob Jordens, the city's leading painter after the deaths of Rubens and Anthony van Dyck, was a prolific designer of tapestries. Particularly notable in the present context is his illustration of the proverb, "The pitcher goes to the well till it breaks," which plays with Rubens' idea in the Eucharist series of a tapestry depicting a tapestry. Whereas his series, Scenes from Country Life, is closer in conception to Rubens' Achilles series. This series also inspired Jan van der Hoeke, who trained under Rubens and who in the late 1640s designed a series of tapestries depicting allegories of time. Here are two examples from the set depicting the months. Sometimes looking at a marginal and seemingly obvious feature of a work offers a fresh route to explore hitherto unnoticed aspects. Looking at the way in which Rubens dealt with the framing of the Eucharist tapestries has led me to conclude that the illusionistic painting of the facade of his own house was the major inspirational force behind his unique solution for the Archduchess's tapestries. It is my contention that the triumph of the Eucharist series is such a brilliant invention precisely because Rubens was not aiming at creating a spectacular tapestry ensemble, but rather a spectacular ecclesiastical space. So, does this mean Rubens was not a good designer of tapestries? Thank you.
So here to answer that question. Did you guys plan that? Our final paper, Koen Brosens, teaches at the University of Leuven, where he offers courses in particular on the making and meaning of European tapestries. He has published widely on tapestries in international publications, contributing to the catalogs of recent tapestry exhibitions held at the Met in New York. His books include a contextual study of Brussels tapestry, 1670 to 1770, and European tapestry in the Art Institute of Chicago, and most recently, and perhaps most relevant to us today, the magisterial Corpus Rubenianum volume on Rubens' Constantine Tapestry series, just hot off the press. And actually, we just invited him for comic relief. He's the one that needed the little parasols on the drinks.
Well, thank you, Maureen. First of all, I would like to join my fellow speakers in thanking Virginia and Alexandra and, of course, Maureen and Barbara and Sonia for planning and organizing this event and for inviting me. It certainly is a privilege and a pleasure to be here today, and I can only hope you'll invite me in 2042 when you do the next Symposium on Rubens. It would be the year before my retirement. So perhaps I could stay in Florida after the symposium then. Okay, Katrien, if you're watching this online, give me a call and let me know how you feel about retirement in Florida. Okay. Good. I think I speak for all of us when I say that it has been a very interesting day, but I realize it has also been a long day, and I must confess that when attending a symposium, I always have difficulties focusing on the very last speaker of the pack. Perhaps that's just me, and perhaps it's true what my high school teacher said, that I have the attention span of a drunken goldfish. But still, I think you might be relieved to learn that the last paper deals with a simple question, a very simple, straightforward, binary question: was Rubens a good tapestry designer? And the paper has 3 parts. First, I'm going to tell you more about the genesis and the relevance of this question, and I will then analyze Rubens' designs for tapestry, which will allow me to answer the question. And then finally, I will support my position by examining the Rubens' footprint on 17th century tapestry design and tapestry production. Okay, first things first. Is it useful or necessary to ask ourselves if Rubens was a good tapestry designer? Rubens himself would have been shocked. He would have been shocked to see that somebody had a nerve to raise this question, to doubt his qualities as a tapestry designer, for he was convinced that he excelled in creating monumental cycles. Betsy already gave us the famous citation. I give it in French because it's even more arrogant in French. Okay, so but basically it says, well, I confess that I am by nature, by natural instinct, better fitted to execute very large works than small curiosities. We all have our talents, and my talent is that I'm capable of executing even the largest and most diverse projects. And interestingly, Rubens' claim has never been challenged. On the contrary, ever since the 1960s or so, art historians have hailed Rubens as an innovator of tapestry design, as its savior even. In Rubens' Textiles, for example, a book that was published in 1997, we find the following ode to Rubens. Thanks to Rubens, it was claimed, the rather stiff style of the late Renaissance masters had to make way for splendid, dynamic figures full of grace and life. No wonder, the ode continues, no wonder that the well-known Brussels tapestry producers were so anxious to draw on his skill to inject new life into their production. After the troubled years of the religious wars, followed by the fall of Antwerp and emigration, the art of designing cartoons for tapestries had almost come to a standstill. Given this status, it is no surprise that Rubens was omnipresent in the wonderful and highly acclaimed Tapestry in the Baroque, Dress of Splendor exhibition held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2007. Indeed, the show included tapestries and sketches of the Decius Mus set, the Eucharist series, and the Constantine set. At the time of the exhibition, I was a visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, so I had the opportunity to go to the exhibition a couple of times, and I spent a lot of time in this gallery. For at the time, I was just being asked to write the volume on the Constantine series. And it was in this gallery, sitting on that little bench, that I started to have doubts about Rubens' qualities as a tapestry designer. And these doubts were triggered by something I experienced in the gallery and by something I read in the exhibition catalogue. The experience I had was a bit confusing. The more I looked at the tapestry, the less appealing it became. And I really did my best to like the piece. After all, this was Rubens, and one is supposed to like Rubens, and especially if you have to write a volume for the Corpus Rubenianum Ludwig Burchard. But I could not help falling in love with another tapestry, a tapestry that was hanging on the opposite wall, the Finding of Moses, designed by the French painter and contemporary of Rubens, Simon Vouet. And like every scientist who feels a sudden surge of emotion, I was completely confused, and I tried to rationalize the phenomenon. So I set up an experiment. I turned the gallery into a boxing arena, Rubens in one corner and Simon Vouet in the other. And I started to study the behavior of the people that came into the gallery, as I wanted to find out which designer they preferred. So I timed how long people looked at the two tapestries, and I even eavesdropped on the conversations. And the outcome of this little experiment was crystal clear. Vouet simply crushed Rubens. Okay, so spending time in the gallery triggered the first doubt. And something I read in the exhibition catalogue further fueled the nagging suspicion that Rubens may not have been the king of tapestry design after all. In the book, it was argued that tapestries woven after designs by Rubens, and I quote, lack the richness of design and enlivening patterns that characterized the great examples of the 16th century and, indeed, of later 17th century productions, both in Brussels and elsewhere, unquote. And this observation certainly made sense, and in a way it helped me, it helped a little bit to explain why I, and indeed most visitors who came into the gallery, were not charmed by the Rubens tapestry. And the essay in the exhibition catalogue also provided an explanation. It said the success of Rubens' tapestry designs depends on the skills of the weavers who interpreted them in woven form. So put differently and slightly less academic, it's okay if you don't like Rubens, but that's not his fault. You have to blame the tapestry weavers, because they failed to get it right. That's basically what's been said in the catalogue. And of course, I found this explanation very unconvincing. After all, Brussels tapestry weavers were highly skilled artists who had executed dazzling tapestries before Rubens and continued to do so afterwards. So their expertise and skill are beyond doubt. And this, of course, implies that the flaws and weaknesses have to be sought in the designs and not in the tapestries. And this brings me to the second part of the paper, in which we are going to take a closer look at the designs by Rubens. It has often been claimed, and rightly so, that while creating his tapestry series, Rubens drew heavily on his vast knowledge of classical art and Renaissance art, and especially on Raphael, who, as is well known, also based himself on classical art. And as a result, Rubens' tapestry sets, all 4 of them, display a classical monumentality. The figures almost fill the pictorial plane, and landscape and architectural settings are stripped down to their bare essence. And when we compare the designs by Rubens with the Mannerist tapestries that were woven in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, so just before Rubens, like this one, shows the entry of Constantine into Rome, it is clear that there's an enormous gap between Rubens on the one hand and his predecessors on the other. And of course, Rubens' bold departure from Mannerist designs is precisely why he is now regarded as the leading designer, the innovator, the savior of 17th century tapestry. However, I argue that this view is faulty. It is based on the assumption that innovation is good. It is based on the assumption, on the hasty assumption, that in the end tapestries are a lot like paintings, and it fails to give attention to the qualities and specificity of tapestry. So I'm certainly not claiming that Rubens was a bad painter. He was a great painter. Okay? I'm saying that Rubens was not a good tapestry designer. And let me clarify this claim by focusing again on this tapestry, the entry of Constantine into Rome. We don't know the name of the designer, but that's fine. We don't need to know the name of the designer to look at the tapestry. Okay, so what do we see? We see a crowded composition set in a world landscape that gives a strong impression of receding space. The eye is led from the soldiers in the left foreground to the small group of women on the right, and from Constantine's procession to the triumphal arch, the cityscape and the secondary action taking place in the middle ground and background. And this dynamic zigzag composition invites us to step into the tapestry and to start a voyage of discovery around the scene. And the wide border, filled with flowers, fruit, strapwork, and mythological scenes, further enhances the visual appeal and richness of this piece. And finally, the bright and simple local colors produce a peaceful rhythm and create unity in diversity. So in short, though the entire surface is covered, the tapestry neither emphasizes the space in which the viewer finds himself, nor intrudes into that space. On the contrary, the tapestry dissolves the wall on which it hangs by presenting itself as a window or even a doorway into a colorful fiction beyond reality. And let us now look at Rubens. It is clear that Rubens eliminated this interactive and decorative dimension almost completely. The monumentality of the figures and the frieze-like quality of the scenes supersede any picturesque qualities, confirming and even reinforcing the limitations of the space in which they hung, thus forcing the viewer to step back. So, while the tapestry designers operating around 1600 had warmly invited the viewer to explore the tapestries and even participate in the action, Rubens pushed his audiences away and forced them into a far more passive and less playful role. And this difference is crucial. This difference goes to the essence of the medium. Series that were not site-specific, and Rubens made only one site-specific set, the Eucharist series, so I'm excluding the Eucharist series from my talk, but the series that were not site-specific, Decius Mus, Constantine, and Achilles, they had to fulfill certain basic criteria and formulas if they were to be interesting as commercial propositions. And the intrusive and non-inviting qualities of Rubens' series were at odds with these imperatives. And it is in this respect crucial to take a closer look at the commissioners of the sets designed by Rubens. The story of Decius Mus was commissioned by Frans Sweerts, as has recently been demonstrated by Hans Hubach. Sweerts was an Antwerp tapestry dealer and tapestry entrepreneur with a lively interest in classical and Renaissance art and literature, and a friend of Rubens. Rubens' second set, The Story of Constantine, was commissioned by Marek Komans and François de la Planche, the Antwerp and Oudenaarde directors of a tapestry workshop in Paris. The Eucharist series, of course, was commissioned by the Archduchess, Isabella. And finally, The Story of Achilles was financed by the Antwerp merchant Daniel Fourmont, Rubens' father-in-law. So, though it has been stated and widely accepted that the well-known Brussels tapestry producers were so anxious to draw on his skill to inject new life into their production, there was not a single Brussels tapestry producer who decided to invest in cartoons made by Rubens. And this is quite remarkable, because Brussels high-quality tapestry dominated the European tapestry market. And of course, the Brussels producers were always trying to consolidate and strengthen this position on the European market. And it seems they did not include Rubens in their business strategy. And I think the reason is obvious. They very well understood that Rubens' monumental style would not appeal to a lot of people. And these observations force us to reassess Rubens' impact or footprint on European tapestry design and production between about 1620 and 1670. In fact, the observations force us to write a new history of tapestry design in the 17th century, one that is not driven by the assumption that everybody was just so happy when Rubens made his appearance. And this brings me, of course, to the final part of this paper. In Paris, in France, Rubens' Constantine series was a complete failure. It was a commercial failure. And his monumental style, so Rubens' monumental style, was eclipsed by Vouet's lyricism. And it is easy to understand why, I think. Vouet's designs have a distinct, mysterious, and timeless quality. They absorb the viewer. And the next generation of French academic and classicizing painters and tapestry designers, including this one, Michel Corneille, followed in Vouet's footsteps. And meanwhile, Rubens' Constantine cartoons were modified. They were modified to make them more appealing. More pronounced colors and more pronounced color contrasts were introduced. And also flowers, little plants, little rocks, and sometimes even figures and secondary scenes were added to fill the bare landscape settings and make the compositions visually more complex and challenging. Thus, Rubens became Rubens Light. Very similar modifications were made in Brussels, and we can also see that Rubens' heavy architectural and sculptural borders, one of his innovations that have been applauded by art historians, were in fact quickly replaced by more decorative ones, more traditional ones. And art historians usually disdain these alterations and see them as a violation of Rubens' originality and Rubens' genius. But I think that's a bit like waving at Stevie Wonder. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. I don't think that Brussels tapestry producers were thinking, okay, it's Monday, I'm going to violate Rubens' genius. No, they were thinking, okay, there seems to be a problem. There seems to be a problem with these heavy Baroque designs. So let's try to find a solution. And so part of the solution was to modify Rubens' cartoons. And another part was to promote tapestry designers that shared Rubens' monumental style to a certain extent, but did not push away the audiences. And one of these painters was Jacob Jordaens, who created 8 sets for the Brussels industry. And obviously, his style is reminiscent of Rubens' manner, but there are also major differences between Rubens and Jordaens. Jordaens strikes a more refined balance between the figures and the architectural and landscape settings, and more importantly, Jordaens was an entertaining storyteller, developing far less dramatic and serious sets than Rubens. And Justus van Egmond, who created 3 or 4 sets for the Brussels industry around 1650, was another Baroque painter who managed to fuse monumentality with entertainment. His cartoons present a theatrical and quite ironic view of iconographic and stylistic grandeur. And this battle scene is a perfect illustration of this approach. This is a battle scene, but Caesar, he's quite relaxed, and he's leaning on his horse, while producing something of an oversized paper knife to scare away the enemy. And in the top corner you can see a battle scene as done by Rubens. It's a big difference. Moreover, it would be wrong to identify Jordaens and van Egmond as the leading designers between about 1620 and 1670. It would be wrong to think that all tapestries produced in Brussels and elsewhere in the Low Countries between 1620 and 1670 show monumental figures arranged in frieze-like compositions. In fact, the majority of tapestries woven in Brussels and elsewhere in the Low Countries echoed late 16th century Mannerist design. This tapestry was woven around 1650. What happened? A considerable number of late 16th century cartoons remained in use throughout the 17th century. Cartoons were very expensive, so they kept on recycling, adapting the cartoons. And these cartoons, these 16th century cartoons, the cartoon on which this tapestry is based was actually created around 1560, so it was still in use 100 years later. So these cartoons had proven their value throughout the ages, and they could easily be transformed into cartoons, fusing the best of both worlds. The figures were made slightly more monumental, yet the decorative landscape and architectural settings secured a sense of space and invited the viewer to step into the narrative. The Brussels painters that restored and modified the 16th century cartoons were Antoon Sallaert and Lancelot Lefebvre. Sallaert and Lefebvre also designed new sets for the Brussels tapestry industry, and together they recycled and created about 30 to 35 sets. Remember, Rubens did 4 sets, Jordaens 8, van Egmond 3 or 4. And Sallaert and Lefebvre certainly understood the power of the 16th century formulas. Let's take a look at this tapestry, for example, showing the Battle of the Milvian Bridge from the Constantine series designed by Lefebvre. Unfortunately, the piece is in poor condition, so please don't look at the colors, but look at the composition. And what do we see? We see a dynamic zigzag composition with a marked effect of space, as opposed to Rubens's flat frontality, as you can see in the top corner. And this, of course, reminds us of the tapestries woven in the 16th century and early 17th centuries. After the death of Antoon Sallaert and Lancelot Lefebvre, around 1650, the Brussels tapestry producers realized they had to find a fashionable successor. And guess what? They went to Paris. They went to Paris and they found this man, this painter, Charles Poisson. Charles Poisson, a former assistant of Simon Vouet. And Charles Poisson created 5, possibly 6 sets that were woven in Brussels over and over again in the late 1650s, 1660s, and 1670s. This is a tapestry created by designed by Poisson, showing a scene from the Story of Titus series. And if you take a look at the borders, the colors, and the composition that winds through the foreground and the background, it becomes evident that by 1660, Rubens's pared-down austerity was all but forgotten. And this brings me to the conclusion, and I think the conclusion can be quite short. By taking a closer look at Rubens's tapestry designs, and by analyzing the production of Flemish and French tapestry producers between 1620 and 1670, it becomes clear that they, and the vast majority of their clientele, would have answered no when asked if they believed that Rubens was a good tapestry designer. I'm Koen Brosens, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for these wonderful talks. Provocative, in a way. Your willingness to challenge long-held beliefs is wonderful, refreshing, and precisely the goal of a symposium such as this dedicated to new approaches. Your research, of course, dovetails on the question of invention, acknowledging, as you both do, the novelty, at least, of Rubens's designs, as well as your acknowledgement of market concerns in tapestry design. And one of the things that I have found especially interesting in this session is what we might identify as your moment of divergence, and in particular, where you differ on Rubens's perception of Rubens. Fiona, you suggest that Rubens never set out to be a great tapestry designer maker specifically, but rather sought to be a great master of illusion, regardless of his medium. Whereas Koen, you imply that Rubens did have grand ambitions, but failed due to his misunderstanding that tapestries are not simply woven paintings. And as you've noted, he was exceptionally proud of his work in tapestry, not only from that wonderful quote, but I think we could even add his correspondence to Sir Dudley Carleton in 1618, when he says, I have had great experience with tapestry makers of Brussels, though many commissions which have come to me from Italy and elsewhere from similar works. I myself have made some very handsome cartoons at the request of certain Genoese gentlemen, and which are now being worked. And the question of self-perception, though impossible to know really, is an important one because, as you've articulated, I think, so nicely, it really has dictated the way that we discuss Rubens in general, which is to say, on his terms. And as we consider this, we cannot fail to acknowledge, I think, as Fiona has reminded us, that he was, in the end, at the time, extremely successful. And I'd like to open the floor, of course, to anyone who has questions, but I thought I might start out with one myself for you, Koen, which is, where do we take into account audience? These, his forays were not only for an international group, but for a specifically courtly audience, whereas some of perhaps the tapestries that you presented us today were not. I mean, what do we need to know about Decius Mus Constantine specifically?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to. That's why I stress I put a stress on the identity of the commissioners of the series, because basically they wanted to make money, I think, and they wanted to produce a tapestry series that could be bought by European kings and ecclesiastical rulers, but they wanted to reach as many people as possible with the sets. And I also think that what we discussed earlier about the different solutions for the Eucharist series, the iconographic program and different possibilities, that also applies to the Constantine set, for example. People have written a lot about the exact iconographic program of the Constantine set, of the Achilles series, but in the end people just wanted to buy 12 tapestries, or perhaps 10 tapestries, or perhaps 8 tapestries. And they just picked a certain number of subjects, and they created their own version or their own story of Constantine and Achilles. Yeah. So I think that might be one of the reasons why the other day somebody asked me if Rubens failed to get it right or didn't want to get it right.
Yeah.
And of course there's a big difference. And I think that Rubens was not happy with the idea that people were going to change his iconographic program.
Yeah, I mean, what struck me too is that, the distinctly Italian quality of these figures, and the idea that these tapestries, for Paris or that ended up in Rome, right, have a distinct, these are Italophilic centers. Or these are, places where people have...
But you're referring to what might have been the first edition of the Constantine series, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. First of all, it's not certain that it is the Editio Princeps of the series, and secondly, it was a gift.
Yes.
Because some of the negotiations with the papal nuncio went really bad, and they tried to make a peace offering. The French king just gave some Constantine tapestry series, and of course, they would have appealed to the Italians.
Yes.
Yeah. Definitely, because it's all Raphael, basically. The whole Constantine set is Raphael and classical art via Raphael or vice versa. But of course, in Italy, that's just one market segment.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, it seems to me that he always sort of tailored himself to a specific market, though. He doesn't seem
but it doesn't make sense to invest a lot of money in tapestry cartoons. It was very expensive to invest in tapestry cartoons, and then just try to focus on one specific market. That's commercial suicide, more or less. So,
if I may ask then, I mean, why do you think Daniel Faurmont commissioned the Achilles series quite late? I think you argue that it was in the late 1630s that Rubens did this, rather than the early 1630s, as has hitherto been believed. I mean, surely then an experienced tapestry dealer like Faurmont would have realized this is not what people are looking for. And yet Rubens designed a quite erudite, iconographically complex series.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know why Faurmont made that decision. But of course, by then we had some Jordan sets that were created. Anton Sallard made some sets in the 1620s and 1630s, so perhaps he believed that people were now ready for the monumental style by Rubens, even though that the Achilles series is the most decorative series of all. I have one other observation to make regarding the motivation behind the commission of the Eucharist series. I thought about it actually during my talk. I think it's important to realize that the Archduke and the Archduchess have always supported the Brussels tapestry industry. Yes. They gave a lot of commissions to Brussels tapestry producers, and they also installed a system of tax relief supporting the industry. And I think it's important to look at the date when the Eucharist series was commissioned, 1626. At that point, the production centers in Paris became more important, and also you had the establishment of the Mortlake workshop, which you showed us. And at that point, we know that a lot of Brussels tapestry weavers went to London, to Mortlake, to work for the new workshop. So it could be possible if we take, that's a more mundane approach, just the history of tapestry history. It's possible that we need to look at the history of tapestry production in Brussels and elsewhere in Europe to understand partially the motivation behind the commission. And
I don't want to ignore you, Fiona, because I have some questions for you too, and I'm sure everyone does as well. But one last, if you don't mind, which is, what about Antwerp production? I mean, there were Antwerp weavers, and certainly I was thinking of there's that Michael de Bos, the Labors of Hercules series, which has those huge figures and the sort of limited color palette. I mean, that seems to be not as intimate and detailed, and that sort of picture view, like you were talking about, is the Brussels tradition. So, is it possible that Rubens was harnessing a more Antwerp-based?
It's possible. The only problem is with the tapestry production in Antwerp in the first third of the 17th century. So when Rubens made his series, I think the production was had a lot of difficulties at that point, especially with the rise of the other production centers in Europe. And it's only after 1650, 1660 that we have a new wave of tapestry production in Antwerp. But we know that, and it's a good question actually, because we know that some of the later Decius Mus tapestries were woven in Antwerp, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Fiona, without coming to a fisticuffs a la Hell Jaffe, I was wondering if you might be interested in responding to Susan's hypothesis, because we've talked about now the borders and sort of delightful deceit, theoretical or theologically rhetorical. I mean, do you have thoughts on?
Well, I don't think you have to.
Or are they not mutually exclusive?
Choose one over the other. I think there are just different ways of experiencing the tapestries. And actually, during Susan's talk, I was just thinking, or wondering what kind of illusionary art Spanish audiences had been subjected to. I mean, I showed 2 Italian examples. Raphael, I mean, people were accustomed to looking and seeing and identifying visual illusions. But I wonder to what extent a Spanish audience knew such things. I mean, I don't think, or I don't know of many Spanish frescoes or wall paintings which play with illusions. So the tapestries would have been, from the illusionary point of view, I think quite an eye-opener, if I may use that word. But again, I don't think there's any contradiction to what Susan was saying. Quite the opposite. I think that both would play into one another. And this conversion of the church into an architectural, magnificent building, which it obviously wasn't in its normal state.
Yes. Please, yes, Susan. If you Now it begins.
The idea of fisticuffs with Fiona is too amazing to ponder. But
Koen will make a poster.
no, I really enjoyed both talks, and I had a question for you, Fiona, but maybe I'll put that aside. And just this question about what the Spanish audiences were accustomed to is really fascinating to me, because I think there is a history of trompe l'oeil in Spain in devotional art. I'm just not sure how it measures up with the tapestries. And I also think there's a tradition in Spain of this polychrome sculpture that's carried around, say, in Semana Santa processions, that has a kind of resonance with Rubens's, with a kind of thinking about illusionism that's quite complex. So right now I'm teaching this class on 17th century Spanish art, and I was showing my students a Zurbaran crucifixion, which is in fact very, it's a painting, but if you were to see it in relatively low light, say with candles, it really is three-dimensional. Mm-hmm. It's very much like a kind of trompe l'oeil painting, and all of a sudden I went, oh my God. I don't have a definitive answer to your question about the Spanish audiences, but I wonder whether they actually had some insights that people who look more at Northern art aren't taking into account, say, for example, as I was. I mean, that there are some ways in which illusionism plays into the practice of devotional art in Spain in different ways than in the North.
I can't answer that because I really don't know much about the Spanish.
Yeah, certainly Zurbaran does. He has this lamb, this bound lamb.
Yes, I know that. Yeah,
very. And then there's the polychrome sculpture, which is carried around in the processions, and which is in the Descalzos Reales. My question for you was what you think of the. I sort of glossed over this in my talk, but actually those tapestries, within the tapestries, are very problematic in a way as trompe l'oeil. People are often confused by them because the figures look as if they're painted. Actually, this could go to either one of you. It's like those trompe l'oeil tapestries as trompe l'oeil tapestries become clear as trompe l'oeil if you look to the edges. But if you're really looking into the center, they actually work more in the way of painting a regular a painting with a recession into depth from the frame would look than a trompe l'oeil. And I wondered if you'd thought about that at all.
Well, I have to say I hadn't really, but I suppose in a way that plays really into what Koen was saying, that Rubens wasn't thinking in terms of that he would say, put a fold in the middle where one of the figures, then there would be a fold that you could actually see the materials.
Right.
So you really only do judge the tapestry at the edge. And I suppose it's this idea that from far away you see the figures and you think, architecture and figures, and then as you go closer you see, their edges, this is a tapestry. So it's an experience that doesn't come all at once. It's more an exploring the surface, and then you see various aspects. And again, I would think that these figures that are coming up from sort of the depths, where you don't really know what level they're at, I think then if you intellectually think about it, you know they must be part of the tapestry.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't see the edge. But this is Rubens's way of playing with perception and illusion.
Mm-hmm.
Koen, anything to...
I'll cede the microphone.
But Virginia, would you like to? Yeah.
So I have questions for both of you. I'll start with Fiona. I think it's fascinating the idea that the idea of creating a sort of the tapestries were in some regard inspired by the paintings on the front of the house. And I also noticed when you, or sort of early on in your talk, you were showing borders that imitated colored marble or borders that imitated a sort of bejeweled, a piece of something that was bejeweled.
Wood.
Bejeweled wood, yes. And maybe thinking, I should admit I'm totally not a Rubens person. I come from a sort of Trecento Italian background, and usually when people try to imitate something, panel painters would try to imitate metalwork. So you were trying to imitate the sort of higher quality material with the lower quality substance. Why? I mean, does it say something about Rubens's kind of self-perception or about the relationship between paintings and tapestries that he was using the high-quality medium of tapestry, or what would ultimately become a tapestry, to imitate a painting or to imitate a source?
Well, I mean, I don't think he was imitating a painting. I mean, what I'm saying is that the decoration of the facade of his house, which was really one of the sights of Antwerp, and I think even if you go to the Rubens house today, you can't really appreciate it because the subtlety which you would get from the grisaille painting is gone. And also this idea that the whole facade with this stairway and the loggia and this painting of Perseus and Andromeda hanging, it was a whole concetto which he devised in imitation of Italian examples. And I think just with the Eucharist series, he wasn't really trying to say, I'm going to design tapestries. I really think that he was designing an illusion. And that perhaps Isabella's admiration of his house and its facade really did prompt him to think, okay, I'll move away from conventional tapestry, because I mean he could have used that. I mean, I think, as Anna showed us, her arrangement certainly allowed for certain tapestries to have a conventional border, but he didn't do that. So I really think he wanted to play with this thing of converting a relatively simple space in the church into something totally magnificent, because it was then such in honor of the Eucharist and deserved the highest aesthetic surround possible. So I think the tapestry was just the means to the end.
Koen, yeah.
It might be a stupid remark, but would it be possible that Isabella commissioned a series of monumental paintings to be hung in Madrid, and then suddenly realized perhaps we could do a set of tapestries so that we can support the industry?
Anyone?
Well, I was just going. My last question for you, which was also in this, that you said, that you sort of left the Eucharist series out of it. Was Rubens a good tapestry designer? Is the Eucharist series, do you feel, in some way distinct from the other pieces? And is it? I mean, and I guess this is a question for the whole group. Is it successful as a tapestry series, as a decorative program?
Things I've
and
never.
So on.
Problem is that it's not possible to see the tapestries, the set in situ, of course. We only see some of the tapestries in exhibitions or in Madrid, and then of course you have the sometimes it's just not right to put some of the tapestries with the Salmonic columns just on eye level because they were hung higher. So it's nearly impossible for me. I don't think it's possible to say something about the quality or the nature of the Eucharist series as such, as long as we don't. But fortunately, it's a little bit better now. We need to know the exact setting and the exact composition of the whole series, and perhaps we have some very nice visualization tools nowadays. Perhaps it would be possible one day to recreate the whole chapel and experiment and try to rearrange and arrange the tapestries in that virtual environment.
Yes. Pilar, would you go to the microphone just so we can...
I am from Spain.
Okay.
Perhaps just a commentary. Perhaps the biggest value of this series could be, in my personal point of view, see all this tapestry during the celebrations, the Corpus Christi or the religious celebrations, because I think that perhaps Rubens, or Isabel Clarogenia, of course, but Rubens, because he was a Catholic, his idea could be that should reinforce the splendor of the liturgy with all this, surround. And if you go, for example, to Spain, and you have the opportunity to go to Toledo, for example, in the Corpus Christi celebration,
my heart
and
bleeds.
you see all these tapestries hanging on the street, and the monstrance, and the people, and the flowers, and the music, is very much things going around. And of course, many people has the religious belief, and many people they have not, but you are participating. You are part of a very special situation, collective situation.
Okay.
And it's the same you talk about in Holy Week, It's more than just see all these beautiful, sculptures, Baroque sculptures on the street, it's the flowers and the smell, the springtime, the candles, the night, a lot of elements,
That's right, but I always see these tapestries hanging in Toledo, and I always wonder, I haven't tried to find it out, but how many of these tapestries were actually commissioned to hang outside? I know that a lot of these series were added later to the collection of a cathedral, and then they were just being used. But the thing is, were they commissioned to be put outside?
Yes.
That's I don't know about that, but we should look at the provenance of each and every tapestry and set that is being used outside, and then we can say something that is based on facts about the use of tapestries outdoors. Because they also did it in Paris in the 1960s.
Yes.
They still, in the Mobilier National, but nowadays they don't do it anymore because...
Well, I want to thank you both for...
Sorry, can I just make
one
one point? It's perhaps interesting that there's a second set of the Eucharist tapestries in Cologne Cathedral, where they are hung around Easter as well, and they are hung around the choir. And when the tapestries were woven, now I'm not sure actually whether they have the twisted columns or the Doric columns, I'm not quite sure, but anyway, all the columns are the same type. So it was a clear decision, these will not hang above each other, even though there is space in Cologne Cathedral for that. So they commissioned then one type of column, and they're hung around the entire choir.
Thank you for that. Yes. Well, thank you both so much. First, let me say what a pleasure today has been. It hardly seems 3 years ago that we began to imagine a symposium devoted to new approaches to Rubens scholarship. So I guess time flies when you're having fun. And as we conclude this session in our Floridian Rubens extravaganza, I would like to offer just a few very brief concluding thoughts. As the papers presented here today have shown, Rubens studies are as vital as ever. Indeed, if you were lucky enough to attend the Renaissance Society of America just last week, you would have heard no fewer than 8 papers devoted to Rubens by junior and senior scholars. Conferences dedicated to Rubens' output, in fact, have taken place every year for the past several years, from York, England, to Boston, one forthcoming in Antwerp, dealing with topics ranging from the Rubensian Nude to the Pompa Introitus series, Rubens' Diplomat. And in fact, according to the College Art Association, there are on average 6 dissertations in American institutions annually, completed or in progress, that deal with this important artist in some way. Of course, when one considers Rubens' inexhaustible artistic talent, as well as his multiple roles he assumed as a collector, connoisseur, humanist, we ought not be surprised that scholars' interest in him has not waned, and how lucky for us that we have 6 such scholars here today. Your papers addressing, among other issues, invention and process, have both confirmed and enriched our understanding of Rubens' theological sophistication and illusionistic prowess. They have also challenged traditionally held notions of his success. For example, when placed within the context of Counter-Reformationist thought and his personal forays into trompe-l'oeil painting, we can never again dismiss the borders on the Eucharist tapestries as simply margins. The complicated process Rubens followed in creating this series is now more fully understood in light of the technical information presented here today, as is the tapestry's display, which has for decades eluded scholars. To date, no one has advanced as comprehensive and concise an installation hypothesis that takes into account both the interior space as well as the intellectual concordance between the imagery and its function. And while these papers offer new insights into process, invention, installation, much still has to be done further to further our understanding of collaboration with artists or advisors, reception and patronage. Indeed, let us not forget Isabella Claire Eugenia, the great patroness for whom we are here today. Anne's wonderful summation of the intersection of art and authority has shed great light on this powerful individual, particularly on her understanding of the complicated maneuverings of court life and the role of art within that space. The circumstances of the commission are still a mystery. Was it a dowry, a gift based on special fondness, an ex voto for Breda? Each proposal brings with it a set of consequences and implications that merit sustained study and consideration. So in conclusion, I would like to thank Anne, Susan, Betsy, Anna, Fiona, and Koen for making the trip to Sarasota to share your wonderful insights. We all feel galvanized by your talks, and I very much look forward to continuing these conversations tomorrow in the galleries. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alex. Really appreciate you coming back and bringing all your expertise and enthusiasm, like I said. Well, okay, if another conference doesn't take place for another 30 years, it's probably a good thing, because there was enough information put out there today. It's going to take that long to digest it. And I have to say that you were a great audience. You were really captivated, obviously, by what was going on, because you really fell down on your job to pray for good weather because it rained while we were in here. But thanks to everyone here who helped make this event possible. Thanks to my colleagues, both here and at FSU. Thanks to our scholars who have, as I said, traveled a distance to be here. And thanks for all of you for participating today. Now, we've been talking about art all day, but a good museum educator wants you to go look at art. Look at the real thing. So you've got a good 45 minutes to go look at the Eucharist cartoons. Uh-oh. I didn't say that. The large monumental Eucharist paintings in the Rubens galleries. And our special exhibition Impressions of a Master, which features the Rubens prints juxtaposed with our Rubens paintings. We're going to hold the galleries open until about 6 o'clock tonight. So I invite you all to go and, with some newfound eyes and insights, look at these great works of art. And thank you again.
Okay.